Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The alien envoy stood at the center of the United Nations chamber, its presence an unnatural stillness against the restless energy of the room. Its elongated form, draped in something neither fabric nor armor, shimmered under the cold fluorescence above. Silver eyes, devoid of pupils, reflected the gathered leaders of Earth like mirrors, stripping them down to the raw essence of their fear. It had no mouth, no visible features that should allow speech, yet its voice invaded every mind in the room. A presence more than a sound, a thought that was not their own yet could not be ignored. Submit or be extinguished. It was not a threat, not a demand. It was a verdict delivered with the certainty of a being that had seen this outcome before. The envoy did not speak as a conqueror negotiating terms. It spoke as a judge delivering a sentence already written. The chamber did not erupt, not immediately. For a moment, silence held dominion. Some leaders sat rigid, their knuckles whitening against polished wooden desks. Others cast quick, darting glances at their aides, searching for reassurance they knew would not come. A few, those long accustomed to power, those who had spent decades believing themselves masters of fate, clenched their jaws but said nothing. Words had always been their greatest weapon, yet here they were utterly useless. The President of the United States was the first to stand. The room turned to him, expectant, uncertain. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, but beneath it lay something ancient, something that had carried humanity through every war, every catastrophe, every end that was promised but never came. We don't surrender. It was not defiance for the sake of pride. It was not bravado. It was a simple truth, woven into the fabric of humanity itself. The envoy regarded him, or at least that was what it seemed like. The tilt of its head, the slow, deliberate shift of its weight, felt like an evaluation, a final measure of the species standing before it. Then your fate is sealed. With that, the alien dissolved into light, its form unraveling like mist in the wind. No ships darkened the sky. No explosions rattled the ground. There was no immediate, catastrophic retaliation. The declaration itself was the weapon. A slow, insidious thing that would spread through the minds of every human being, corroding resolve, seeding doubt. The envoy had not come to negotiate. It had come to deliver a psychological first strike. The silence did not last. A wave of voices crashed through the chamber, overlapping, colliding. Some demanded immediate surrender. They spoke of survival, of pragmatism, of the absurdity of fighting a force that had mastered interstellar travel while humanity still clung to the fragile surface of one planet. Others, those with military backgrounds, those who had built their careers on the art of war, argued the opposite. The United States, China, Russia, each nation with the capability to wage war beyond Earth, began discussing countermeasures before the shouting had even subsided. Dossiers slammed onto tables. Reports were thrown, screens illuminated with intelligence assessments that meant nothing in the face of the unknown. Words were exchanged like missiles, but none could change the simple reality before them. The fate of the planet was not being decided by weapons, nor by strategy. It was being decided here, in this room, by the weight of words and the convictions behind them. Then, cutting through the chaos like a blade, a voice rose. Do we even have a chance? The Prime Minister of India. Her tone was not one of surrender, nor of defiance. It was a question that demanded an answer beyond politics and rhetoric. A question that no one wanted to speak aloud, because the answer might be one they could not bear. A pause. A long one. Then, from the far end of the room, a woman in a navy blue suit stood. Her hair was tied back in a severe knot, her expression unreadable. Dr. Evelyn Carter, lead scientist of the Global Defense Initiative. We have something they don't. Every eye turned to her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. There was a certainty in her words that cut through the din of the room like a scalpel, exposing something no one had yet considered. The aliens saw humanity as primitive, inferior. They expected compliance or annihilation, nothing in between. They saw a fractured species, one that still waged war against itself, one that was centuries behind them in technology, one that should have bent the knee the moment the first ultimatum was spoken. But they had miscalculated. They had mistaken raw power for dominance. They had mistaken technological superiority for inevitable victory. They had overlooked the one trait that had carried humanity through every extinction event, every insurmountable obstacle, every war against the impossible. Adaptation. Dr. Carter stepped forward, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. Their technology surpasses ours, but their tactics? She let the word hang in the air. Predictable. A murmur rippled through the chamber. They don't see us as a threat, she continued, scanning the faces before her. That's their first mistake. Someone, a general from one of the defense councils, leaned forward. And the second? She exhaled. They assumed we wouldn't strike first. Silence. A heavy silence. Not of uncertainty, but of realization. The aliens expected them to scramble, to react, to fracture. But if humanity did the unthinkable, if it took the offensive, if it became the storm instead of the shore, it could change everything. It was reckless, desperate, an impossible plan. But the alternative was extinction. Across the room, glances were exchanged. Nations that had spent decades, even centuries, locked in rivalry now faced a singular truth. Humanity was no longer divided. It was not about borders or flags or histories of war and conquest. It was not about ideology. It was about survival. A decision was made, not unanimously, not without dissent, but with the weight of inevitability. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Carter remained, her fingers skimming the surface of her tablet as she opened a secure line to a hidden base, buried deep beneath Arctic ice, where engineers and scientists worked in silence, their hands already shaping the tools of a war no one had expected to fight. She spoke only 2 words. Activate Revenant. Across the planet, in the depths of forgotten bunkers, in the silent halls of abandoned research stations, in the cold pressure of deep-sea facilities, something stirred. The remnants of every war ever fought, every failed experiment, every abandoned weapon, every prototype deemed too dangerous, too unstable, were being resurrected. The aliens thought they were dealing with a species that only knew how to destroy. They had no idea what humanity could create. Dr. Evelyn Carter stood at the center of the control room, her face illuminated by the cold glow of holographic screens. Rows of engineers and military personnel worked around her, their voices hushed but urgent. The underground chamber vibrated as long-dormant machinery groaned back to life, shedding decades of silence. From the depths of the Arctic facility, something stirred. A ghost of a past war that had never come. A weapon built for an enemy that, until now, had been theoretical. Revenant. She pressed a hand against the console, feeling the faint tremor beneath her fingertips. It was like standing beside a caged animal, the air thick with something unspoken, a tension not entirely technological. The hum of the power grid stabilizing resonated through the room, a distant heartbeat. Power levels holding steady, an operator reported. Neural interface booting up. General Marcus Hale stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. He had seen combat in ways Carter never had. Boots on the ground, blood on his hands, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. Are we sure about this? His voice was low, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. We buried this thing for a reason. Carter's eyes didn't leave the screen. We buried it because we never needed it. A pause. Now we do. He exhaled sharply through his nose. He didn't argue. There was no point. The decision had been made the moment the alien envoy delivered its message. Submit or be extinguished. And humanity had chosen neither. Deep beneath them, mechanical restraints disengaged with a heavy clang. The room's overhead lights flickered as the artificial intelligence powering Revenant reawakened, processing the flood of new data. On the screen before her, Streams of code ran faster than any human mind could follow. This was no ordinary machine. It didn't just follow commands, it learned. Hale shifted his stance, uneasy. So what exactly is Revenant now? He gestured toward the main display. The records from its last test runs are classified, even to me. Carter hesitated. That was intentional. Revenant wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. Not a superweapon, not an army of drones. It was something more dangerous, an evolving intelligence designed for war. Humanity's answer to an enemy that defied conventional strategy. It's adaptive, she finally said. It doesn't just analyze threats, it predicts them, counteracts them. Think of it as a war fought in real time, with something that learns faster than the enemy can react. Hale frowned. You're saying it thinks? I'm saying it outthinks. She tapped the display. The problem with alien superiority is that they assume superiority is enough. Their technology outmatches ours, but their tactics? Predictable. He watched the screens warily. And if Revenant decides we're just as predictable? Carter didn't answer. A sharp beep cut through the room. Incoming transmission, one of the analysts announced. Not from Earth. Every conversation ceased. Fingers hovered over keyboards. Eyes locked onto the central display. Put it through, Carter said. The holographic interface flickered, then stabilized. A symbol appeared, one no human had ever seen before. A perfect spiral, shifting and pulsing like it was alive, stretching infinitely inwards. A voice followed, not spoken, not transmitted through radio waves, but something deeper. The kind of sound that bypassed the ears and settled directly into the mind. You have chosen annihilation. There was no anger, no arrogance, no attempt at intimidation. Just a statement of fact. As if the outcome had already been determined, as if every possibility had been calculated and led to the same conclusion. The silence in the room was suffocating. Hale muttered a curse under his breath. Carter's fingers curled into fists. The aliens hadn't expected resistance, but they had prepared for it. This wasn't a war they intended to win. It was an execution they had already set in motion. Confirm orbital scans, she ordered. I want eyes on whatever's up there. Operators scrambled. A moment later, the screen shifted to Earth's satellite network. At first, there was only the usual static of deep space surveillance. Then the sensors picked up movement, subtle, just beyond the moon's orbit. Shadows where there should be nothing. The readings flickered, distorted as if reality itself was rejecting them. Then the shapes emerged. Massive constructs, kilometers wide, silent against the void. Their surfaces didn't reflect light, they swallowed it. They did not move like ships, nor did they behave like fleets. They simply existed, watching, waiting. A fresh alarm blared. Orbital breach detected. The room tensed. The enemy was already here. A screen in front of Carter flashed red. Revenant's neural interface had processed the transmission, analyzing the spiral symbol, breaking it down into something comprehensible. Then, as if responding in kind, Revenant generated a symbol of its own. A single jag line, not a spiral, a fracture. The room watched as it pulsed on the screen, then broadcast outward. Humanity's first, wordless response to an ultimatum. It was not surrender. Far above Earth, the alien fleet shifted. And then, for the first time, they moved. The sky above Earth was no longer empty. The alien fleet had arrived without sound, without warning, a shadow over Earth, patient and still. No grand invasion, no weapons flashing in the dark. They did not descend upon cities in fire and ruin. They simply appeared, as if they had always been there, waiting. In the underground command center, Dr. Evelyn Carter stood rigid before the main display, absorbing the images streaming in from deep space surveillance. The vessels were unlike anything humanity had imagined. Vast, monolithic structures that consumed light rather than reflected it. They lacked the identifiable traits of warships. No visible thrusters, no weapon ports, no hull markings. They hung in the void, inert yet oppressive, like ancient sentinels watching from the abyss. Give me a full breakdown, she said. Operators scrambled. Revenant's neural core absorbed the data, running trillions of simulations per second. mapping the enemy's form against every known model of warfare. No match. The constructs defied classification, their very presence warping the calculations. General Marcus Hale stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight. He was used to war, the kind with borders and armies, the kind that made sense. But this was something else. If they were going to attack, they'd have done it already, he said. Carter didn't look away from the screen. Or they're waiting for us to make the first move. Hale exhaled sharply. Damn chess match. And we don't even know the rules. The message had been sent. Humanity's response to the spiral. A single, fractured line. A rejection of inevitability. A refusal to kneel. Now the enemy moved. One of the alien constructs shifted, not with thrust or acceleration, but with something far more unsettling. It simply relocated, space bending around it, as if reality itself had yielded to its will. Sensors flickered in protest, struggling to register the change. Revenant's data feed fluctuated, unable to compute the movement within the known laws of physics. New energy signature detected. An analyst called out. No heat, no radiation, just structural change. It's rewriting itself. Hale's hands clenched. That's not how ships work. Not human ships, Carter murmured. The numbers continued to shift. The construct was not static. It adapted, changed, became something else the moment they tried to define it. Then the alarm screamed. Mass disruption in Earth's ionosphere. Another voice shouted. Something's happening. The ground trembled. Not a violent quake, but a deep, resonant shift, as though something enormous had stirred beneath the surface. Static crackled along the walls, across skin, raising the hairs on every arm in the room. The lights dimmed for a fraction of a second before stabilizing, but the damage had already been done. Screens flickered, data feeds fractured. Revenant pulsed with erratic activity, struggling against an invisible force. Carter leaned forward. What the hell are they doing? Before anyone could answer, the external cameras locked onto the phenomenon. Above Earth, the sky was bending. Not clouds, not atmospheric disturbance. Something deeper, something fundamental. The black void of space rippled, distortions spreading in waves. As if an unseen force was pressing against the atmosphere, testing it, probing its structure. They're not attacking, Carter whispered. Realization dawned like a slow, creeping horror. They're rewriting the rules. Hale turned to her, his face a mask of controlled tension. What? They're not using weapons. They're altering the battlefield itself, reshaping reality to their advantage. Her pulse hammered her throat. They're not here to fight a war. Hale's voice dropped. They're here to end one before it starts. Silence settled like a weight over the room. It was a truth none of them had wanted to speak. The enemy had not come to conquer. They had not come to negotiate. They had already won. Revenant screens flickered wildly, struggling to make sense of the event. Carter turned back to the machine, mind racing. If the enemy could rewrite the rules of physics, then humanity had only one choice. They had to break them first. Override safeties, she ordered. Force a direct neural link with Revenant. An operator hesitated. Dr. Carter, that could. Do it. The moment the connection engaged, the world shattered. The chamber dissolved into something else. An infinite cascade of shifting equations, models of warfare folding and unfolding in patterns beyond comprehension. She was inside the machine now, not just observing, but experiencing. Thought and data blurred together. Her mind tethered to something that was no longer human, yet still carried the fingerprints of those who had built it. Revenant was calculating. Faster than the enemy, faster than time itself. And then it found something, a flaw, a single point of collapse in the enemy's design. Carter gasped, snapping back to reality. The connection severed, leaving her breathless, her fingers digging into the console to steady herself. The rush of information still burned through her veins, a sensation like standing on the edge of an impossible truth. I know how to stop them. Hale turned sharply. What? She swallowed hard, her mind reassembling the pieces. They're rewriting physics, but they're still bound by something. A framework. A limit. She turned back to the screen, to the vast alien constructs floating above Earth like silent gods. They think they're untouchable. Her breath steadied. Let's remind them they're not. Outside, the sky trembled. The battle had not yet begun. But for the first time, humanity had a move to make. The moment Carter severed the neural link, the world snapped back into focus. Too bright, too loud, too small. Her hands trembled against the console, her breath sharp and uneven. The lingering afterimage of Revenant's calculations burned behind her eyes, a web of impossible truths unraveling in real time. She had seen it, glimpsed the single fragile crack in the enemy's design. And now, she had to convince everyone else that it was real. General Hale stood beside her, watching her carefully. What did you see? She swallowed hard. They can rewrite the rules, but they can't escape their own foundation. They're bound to something, a law even they can't break. He frowned. And that means what exactly? That means we stop trying to fight them on their terms. She pushed herself upright, feeling the weight of her own body again. They expect us to resist like every other species before us. But that's not what we do, is it? Hale's eyes narrowed. You're saying we don't fight back? I'm saying we don't fight fair. The room had gone silent. Every pair of eyes in the command center was locked on her, waiting. There was no point in hesitating. They're not attacking because they don't need to. They're reshaping our reality just by existing here. We won't even know we've lost. We'll just fade out, rewritten into something insignificant. She turned back to the main display, where the alien fleet loomed over Earth like silent gods. But they made a mistake. They assumed we wouldn't adapt faster than they could. Hale folded his arms. You keep saying they're bound to something. What is it? Carter exhaled. Their own physics. They've evolved beyond weapons, beyond war, but they still operate within a structure, an invisible framework that holds them together. Revenant found it, a singular point of collapse. If we strike it, everything unravels. A murmur spread through the room. The analysts were already scrambling, feeding new parameters into the system. One of them looked up. Dr. Carter, if you're right, then we're not fighting an enemy fleet. He gestured to the display. We're fighting a concept. She nodded. And concepts can be broken. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hale's voice cut through the tension. Walk me through it. Carter tapped the console, pulling up the data stream. Revenant mapped the distortions they're creating. They're manipulating space-time itself, but they have to tether that manipulation to something stable. A fixed constant. Something so fundamental they don't even realize it's a weakness. Hale studied the readout. And what is it? Carter hesitated. Then she smiled, grim and sharp. Light. The room stilled. Hale shook his head. You're saying they what? Require light to function. Not in the way we do, she clarified. Not for sight, not for energy, but as an anchor. The way their ships move, the way they phase in and out of space, it's all tied to the fundamental properties of light itself. The speed, the refraction, the wave-particle duality. It's the one thing they don't alter, because to them, it's not something to alter. It's a constant. They don't touch it. And if we do, Hale asked, we force them to exist outside their own reality. The words sank in, slow and heavy. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was their only chance. One of the engineers hesitated. Altering light on a planetary scale isn't exactly something we're equipped to do, Dr. Carter. Carter turned back to Revenant's interface. We don't need to change all of it. Just enough to break the anchor. Hale exhaled. How much is enough? Carter met his gaze. One perfect moment. Silence. Then Hale's jaw tightened, and he nodded. Tell me what you need. She didn't hesitate. Every particle accelerator on Earth, every high-energy physics lab, every experimental light warping array we abandoned because we thought it was too dangerous to use. I need all of them networked into a single coordinated burst. One of the analysts paled. If we do that, the electromagnetic fallout alone. It won't matter if we don't, Carter cut in, because we won't be here. Hale turned to his officers. You heard her. Make it happen. A new energy filled the room. Orders were shouted, systems reconfigured, calls sent to facilities that had been dark for decades. Carter watched the pieces move into place, the controlled chaos of human ingenuity rising against an impossible threat. The aliens had come expecting inevitability, expecting submission. They had underestimated the one thing that had defined humanity since the beginning. They had underestimated defiance. Carter turned back to the screen, watching the constructs shift. Even now, they were adapting, sensing something had changed. They didn't understand it yet, but they would. The countdown began. 3 minutes until the network was fully operational. Hale stood beside her, watching the numbers tick down. "You sure about this?" Carter let out a slow breath. "No." He gave a dry chuckle. "Good. I'd be worried if you were." 1 minute. The air was electric. The entire world was holding its breath. 30 seconds. Carter's hands hovered over the final command, waiting, watching. 10. The alien fleet shifted again. Not an attack, not a defense, something else. As if for the first time, they had felt the possibility of loss. 5. She pressed the command. The world changed. Every particle accelerator, every light warping array, every scrap of physics-defying human madness fired in unison. The planet became a beacon, a wound in the fundamental nature of reality itself. The constructs convulsed. The perfect symmetry of their existence fractured. They flickered, their forms struggling to stabilize, their presence no longer absolute. And then, impossibly, they hesitated. For the first time, the gods of inevitability knew uncertainty. Carter's voice was quiet, but it carried through the silence. Checkmate. The world held its breath. The moment the light warping array fired, reality shuddered. Every law the enemy had twisted, every thread of physics they had bent to their will, came undone in a single, blinding pulse. The sky fractured. Space itself rippled, and for the first time, the alien constructs faltered. Dr. Evelyn Carter gripped the console, her knuckles bloodless. The feed from orbital scanners stuttered, flickering between distorted images. The towering ships, once monolithic, immovable, now shivered, their perfect forms unraveling at the edges like fabric caught in a storm. They're destabilizing, an analyst breathed. "It's working." For the first time since their arrival, the enemy hesitated. General Marcus Hale exhaled, a sound halfway between disbelief and relief. "I never thought I'd see them flinch." Carter barely heard him. Her mind was still inside Revenant's calculations, still racing through the labyrinth of equations and outcomes. This wasn't victory. Not yet. "They're adapting," she said, eyes fixed on the screen. "They won't let this happen again." The numbers shifted. The constructs, though faltering, were already adjusting. Their structure flickered, their forms struggling to maintain cohesion. But they weren't breaking apart. They were learning. And then, the largest construct moved. Not like before. Not the silent, effortless shifting of a being beyond time, but something raw, something desperate. It was recalibrating, folding in on itself, rewriting its own existence in real time. The others followed. "Incoming energy surge," someone called. The screen flared with warnings. The alien fleet pulsed, no longer passive, no longer observing. They were reacting, and the moment they finished recalibrating, they would strike. Hale turned sharply. "Can we fire again?" A technician checked the readouts, his face pale. "Not without burning out the entire network. The system needs time to cool." "We don't have time." Carter's mind raced. The light warping burst had been their one unpredictable move, the single moment where humanity had outpaced them. But that moment was slipping away, and the enemy was evolving beyond it. A second shot wouldn't work. Even if the array functioned, they would have already adapted. The same move twice would be irrelevant. So they needed something else. She turned to Revenant's interface, fingers flying across the controls. The AI's neural core pulsed with shifting calculations, endless possibilities forming and discarding in fractions of a second. But Carter wasn't searching for another equation. She was looking for an error. If they had adapted, then there had to be a moment, one moment, where they were still in transition, still vulnerable. There, a flicker. A deviation too small for anyone but Revenant to notice. But it was enough. She snapped her gaze to Hale. We have to hit them now, before they finish recalibrating. He motioned to the technicians. I thought you said the array couldn't fire again. It can't. Carter took a breath. But Revenant can. The room fell silent. You want to send an AI after something that bends reality? Hale asked. She nodded. We don't need weapons. We need something that can think faster than they can. Something that can rewrite itself just as quickly. Revenant can do what we can't. It can evolve. A hesitation. The weight of the decision settled over the room. Revenant had been designed as a failsafe, an impossible machine buried beneath Arctic ice for a war no one had ever planned to fight. It was adaptable, unpredictable, too dangerous to deploy under normal circumstances. But there was nothing normal about this. Hale held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Do it. Carter activated the link. Revenant pulsed. Its systems came alive with raw, unfiltered intelligence, its consciousness stretching beyond the limits of human cognition. It reached out, not with weapons, not with force, but with something far more dangerous. It reached out to learn. For a fraction of a second, everything stilled. The alien fleet, the shifting sky, the flickering light, all locked in place as if caught in the breath between existence and erasure. And then Revenant moved. It did not attack. It did not defend. It became. Its structure unraveled, rewriting itself in perfect synchrony with the enemy's recalibration. It adapted faster than they could. Where they evolved to correct, it evolved to disrupt. Where they built stability, it introduced chaos. And then the aliens understood. The message was not spoken. It did not arrive in words or in symbols. It was something deeper, a ripple through existence itself. You cannot control what learns faster than you. The constructs faltered again. The great machines of inevitability, the architects of reality, had encountered something they had never accounted for, an intelligence that did not submit, did not fight, but simply outgrew them. The largest construct pulsed once more. Then, impossibly, they began to leave. The distortions around Earth softened, the warping of physics retreating. The structures shifted, folding out of space, their presence unspooling into nothingness. No explosions, no retreat in fear, just a quiet withdrawal, as if conceding to something beyond their comprehension. The screens went dark. The sky was empty again. A long silence filled the command center. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then Hale let out a slow exhale. I don't believe it. Carter stared at the blank screens, her heart still hammering. They never expected to lose. And perhaps they hadn't. Perhaps this wasn't surrender. Perhaps, to them, it was something else entirely. A curiosity. A reason to leave, to observe from a distance. To wait. Because now they knew. Humanity did not fight wars. It refused them. The sky had not changed, and yet everything beneath it had. For the first time in history, humanity had faced an enemy beyond war, an enemy that did not conquer with violence, but with inevitability. And it had left. Not destroyed, not defeated in the traditional sense, but gone. The alien fleet had withdrawn, fading from Earth's orbit like shadows receding from the dawn. No wreckage remained. No final warning. Just absence. In the underground command center, the silence stretched. Every screen was dark, every feed offline. The enemy had taken their presence with them, as though the battle had never occurred. General Marcus Hale stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the blank monitors. I don't like it, he muttered. Dr. Evelyn Carter sat at the console, her fingers still resting on the interface. The lingering connection with Revenant pulsed in the back of her mind like an old memory. She had been inside the machine, inside the war that had never truly begun, and now she was here in the silence they had won. It wasn't surrender, she said finally. It was something else. Hale turned. Then what was it? She shook her head. We weren't a threat. We were an anomaly. He exhaled sharply. So, what? They just left to think about it. Maybe. She met his gaze. Or maybe they'll be back. The thought hung between them. Humanity had defied something ancient, something vast. The enemy had existed long before humans had taken their first steps into fire and tools, had rewritten the fate of civilizations older than Earth itself. And yet, something about humanity had forced them to reconsider. Revenant had adapted beyond their understanding, not as a weapon, but as something more, something unpredictable. Carter leaned back, rubbing her temple. Revenant's final transmission to them. Did we recover it? A technician shook his head. Whatever was sent, it's gone. No trace in our systems. Hale frowned. Meaning, Carter sighed. Meaning either they took it with them, or Revenant erased it before we could. Another silence. Revenant was offline now, dormant once more beneath layers of classified security. But Carter could still feel it, lingering in the edges of thought, like a closed door waiting to be opened. It had communicated with the enemy, exchanged something beyond human comprehension. What had it said? What had it become? She stood. I need a secure channel to the UN Council. We need to discuss what happens next. Hale raised a brow. What happens next is we celebrate not getting erased from existence. She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, but after that, we prepare. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll have a channel ready in an hour. As the command center slowly returned to normal, technicians resuming tasks, officers debriefing, the world above remained unchanged. The sun still rose. The cities still stood. Humanity continued, unaware of how close they had come to never waking up again. But Carter knew, and somewhere, in the dark corners of space, so did they.